Can you believe that first-gen Ryzen processors were released over 6 years ago? And with that, we saw the Ryzen 5 1600 hitting the market and becoming one of the most popular CPUs of the range, thanks to its great price to performance proposition. From its inception, we've had many CPUs in later ranges superseding it, and I want to find out today how things stack up in 2023 when comparing it against the likes of the Ryzen 5 7600 to kind of see how far things have come. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
Okay, so let me start by saying, before a bunch of you run off to the comments, while we are doing this as a bit of a head-to-head, I'm by far not expecting the Ryzen 5 1600 to be anywhere near the performance levels of the Ryzen 5 7600. They are completely different CPUs and in completely different realms of kind of where performance levels should be, and on completely different platforms. And arguably, the upgrade path from a Ryzen 5 1600 is up to a Ryzen 5 5600 or even a 5800X3D. Now that being said, and with some upcoming ideas for content focusing around upgrade paths and where those on older hardware should be looking, we've been going back and testing older CPUs, like the Ryzen 5 1600, to see where it all started. So in the meantime, while we collate that data, I thought it'd be fun to see how far AMD have come in 6 years. So with that in mind, you can expect us to look at CPUs from the Ryzen 2000 series and on in the very near future. Whereas today is all about the first gen, how it performs in 2023 and all that good stuff with a top of the line GPU, and also how it compares against the current generation that has taken over from it. Because I feel, well, there's quite a lot to talk about, and hopefully those of you who are rocking these older CPUs will maybe get something out of it, because, well, not everyone upgrades every time a new product comes to market, and for some, 6 years could be that magic number that sees you kind of itching to upgrade and potentially finding that your old hardware is limiting you in what you're looking to do with your system, and in the sense of what we're looking at today in terms of gaming. So we can look at a whole host of games to see if the Ryzen 5 1600 could actually be holding your system back. Also, getting in before, again, the comments blow up, I'm well aware that no one is going to be running a Ryzen 5 1600 processor with an RTX 4090 like we use for our testing, but it's more to eliminate any bottleneck that we may get from our GPU and to show exactly where the CPU's limitations fall and what an upgrade will do to break through that barrier. Now, to get testing, we had to build a new test bench due to limitations with motherboards accepting the Ryzen 5 1600 due to its age. For this, we put the CPU into the Gigabyte X470 Aorus Gaming 7 Wi-Fi motherboard with 32GB of Kingston Fury Renegade RGB 3600MHz CL16 memory. For the Ryzen 5 7600, we used the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master with 32GB of G-Skill Trident Z5 Neo 6000MHz CL30 memory. Also, as mentioned, we are using the Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X3OC to eliminate any bottlenecks and to push each CPU as far as we can in terms of usage. And all testing was done on the latest update of Windows 11 and with each system's latest respective motherboard BIOS version. Now, for our tests, and to give you the best idea on how performance is, we tested both CPUs on a total of 42 games, of which we'll go through about 15 or so today before we take a look at the percentage differences between each processor. Though if you want to see the charts for all 42 games, you can over on our Patreon, where you'll get a ton of cool perks including access to the charts and help to support everything that we do here so that we can continue to keep making content like this in the future. The link for that is, as always, down below. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, and straight away it's very clear to see how much of a bottleneck the Ryzen 5 1600 is across all resolutions. At all resolutions we do see playable frame rates, though at 1080p it's where we see the Ryzen 5 1600 suffer the most, as the Ryzen 7600, which has been put in for comparison purposes, sits 101% faster overall. At 1440p it's a similar story, some clear limitations from the 1600, with the 7600 now pushing out 58% more performance. While arguably if you are running an RTX 4090, at 4K where the GPU does more of the work, we find the gap draw ever closer, with the 7600 now only sitting 8% ahead. As we move on to Baldur's Gate 3, the gaps are pretty strong across the board, and that's because we're seeing limitations all round from both CPUs. Of course, the 7600 still sits ahead in some cases by a margin of 78%, and while you could argue that 77 to 80 FPS isn't bad, and is still perfectly playable, these are very low numbers for an RTX 4090. Though, playing devil's advocate, you could utilise an RTX 4090 with a Ryzen 1600 and then just upgrade your CPU and motherboard at a later date to unlock the true potential of its performance without being held back. In Call of Duty, we still see some huge limitations from the Ryzen 1600 at 1080p, with the Ryzen 5 7600 now coming in 55% faster overall, while the margin shrinks as we move up in resolution to 40% at 1440p, though frame rates are still at playable levels. And then at 4K we see performance level out slightly as both CPUs are only separated by around 10% or so, and with very similar 1% lows, which is more a testament of how badly the Ryzen 7600 did at 4K, or more than likely how badly the game is optimised overall. Moving over to Cyberpunk, which is a very CPU intensive game, and the 1600 does terribly. The limitations of the performance, even when paired with an RTX 4090, is at an almost unplayable level at all three resolutions. Yes, you can play Cyberpunk at 30 FPS, but with the dips you may start to notice stuttering in places. Though the more important point, I think, is how the 7600, which is many generations ahead, doesn't seem to offer as much of a performance jump as you'd first expect. Now, when we enable ray tracing, this further instills the lack of performance jump. Yes, ray tracing is done on the GPU side of things, but it's been shown that the CPU also takes quite a dramatic hit when running ray tracing based tests. It's here where the 1600 that was already performing quite badly sees a small hit, but nothing of huge significance of around 12% or so. Again, the better performing 7600 takes a larger drop, and at 4K shows that both CPUs give us sub 40 FPS performance, though we're more in the realms of the 4090 suffering here, which is of course where Nvidia will claim that DLSS comes into play. F123 really shows the restrictions of running an older CPU like the Ryzen 5 1600, as we see some pretty stark differences between the 1600 and 7600 processors. At 1080p we see a massive 129% performance margin with the newer CPU, and even then that is hitting a limitation, as 1440p comes in nigh on identically on both CPUs. It's only at 4K where we see some changes though. 63% more performance on the Zen 4 based CPU is something that's hard to ignore when looking at how far things have come over time. Enabling ray tracing again shows a clear bottleneck at 1080 and 1440p, and when looking at the more CPU intensive resolution of 1080p, we see almost 92% more performance coming by the way of the newer Zen 4 chip. At 4K we see the limitation being alleviated somewhat at 91 FPS and coming in within 4% of the Ryzen 5 7600's 95 FPS, so not bad overall, though the GPU is doing a lot more of the work here and is less reliant on the CPU. Booting up Far Cry 6 and we still clearly see the bottlenecks at both 1080 and 1440p, while 4K allows the GPU to do more of the work and actually starts to see some variance on the Ryzen 5 7600. That aside though, the Ryzen 5 1600 came in within margin of error of the same level of performance at all three resolutions, and in the case of the more CPU intensive resolution of 1080p, that sees the newer Zen 4 CPU coming in 144% faster in the averages. Turning ray tracing on didn't actually see as big of a drop as I would have thought. At 1080p with ray tracing enabled, the numbers only dropped around 12%, while the 7600 actually saw a larger dip of 16%. Sadly, no matter the resolution, the OG 1600 sees huge limitations and is really holding the RTX 4090 back, though no one is realistically going to pair a Ryzen 5 1600 with an RTX 4090, but it's the best way to show the ceiling of a CPU. As we move over to Hogwarts Legacy, the Ryzen 5 1600 again shows its age across all three resolutions, with similar performance of around 56 FPS. The saving grace is that the board we use, being the X470 Gaming 7 Wi-Fi, while it supports the Ryzen 5 1600, it also has the support for the Ryzen 7 5800X3D, so there's still an upgrade path that will net you huge gains in performance, which through our own testing will get you around 139 FPS in our setup, which at 1080p gets you an insane 140% uplift in performance, which sits 10% ahead of the Ryzen 5 7600, and would work out the cheaper upgrade as you wouldn't need to change your board or memory. Though this is, I guess, board specific, as not all X470 boards support 1st and 4th generation Ryzen processors. Enabling ray tracing, and naturally we see drops in the levels of performance, though the 7600, which came out stronger in the first place, saw the biggest drops, as you'd expect. Again, we're severely bottlenecked on the Ryzen 5 1600 across all 3 resolutions, and no scenario with that particular CPU will give you a pleasant gameplay experience. Spider-Man at 1080p is playable across all resolutions at around 80 FPS, but when comparing to the 7600, you can see just how much the system and the RTX 4090 is being held back by the processor. This is clear to see when looking at the disparity with the Ryzen 5 7600, which is still seeing some limitations at both 1080 and 1440p, and again, looking at a CPU like the 5800X3D should get you closer to 200 FPS at 1080p using these settings. And maybe that's something we'll look at in a future video. Switching over to ray tracing, and the Ryzen 1600 still gives us playable frame rates for the most part, hitting that magic 60 FPS number. Though to put it into context, if you're running a lower end GPU, which is more than likely, paired with a Ryzen 1600, you're more than likely to be in an area of performance that frankly doesn't do what you're expecting. And the only way around that, sadly, is to upgrade. In Ratchet and Clank, the performance is stronger, though it's a game where the 1% lows are pretty terrible, no matter what hardware you use. We're still severely limited by our Ryzen 5 1600, while the 7600 actually gives us some pretty decent numbers that rival CPUs from the top tier of AMD and Intel's current lineup. When we look at ray tracing performance, it is a similar story. Some playable frame rates that, while they do hold the RTX 4090 back, it's not by the same limitations that we've seen in other games. And at 1080 and 1440p, the 7600 shows that it's more than able to keep up, while the Ryzen 5 1600 falls behind, in some cases by 19%, which I'm not that upset about considering the 2 chips featured are actually 6 years apart. Then lastly, as we boot up Starfield, which is one of the newest titles we're looking at, the Ryzen 5 1600 falls apart with pretty dire performance across the board. The uplift to the Ryzen 5 7600 is between 98 and 165%, depending on the resolution you're looking at, and again, you could more than likely see similar numbers from the 5800X3D, which is looking to be the cheapest upgrade path for someone on an older processor like the Ryzen 5 1600. So some pretty dire numbers in some cases, and some very clear evidence of the limitations that Ryzen's first generation processors have, especially in the form of the 1600. But with just a small sample of games, it gives us an idea, but looking at a whole suite is always kind of a better way to gauge how things look. It's here when looking at the percentage differences in all 42 games, it's a pretty clear indication as to what an upgrade from the Ryzen 5 1600 to the 7600 will give you in terms of a performance uplift. And overall, that equates to 122% improvement across all 42 games. Of course, some games are more CPU intensive and some are more GPU intensive, which is shown when we look at the likes of Assassin's Creed Valhalla with a 188% increase over the 1600, while the bulk of the games sit between 101 and 150% better on the newer Zen 4 CPU. There are a few titles, while they do see increases, it's nowhere on the same levels, with the likes of Dying Light 2 at 46%, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 55%, and Control at 56%, which are still healthy gains regardless. Now, something we wanted to include as per request was the temperatures and power consumption for the CPUs we've tested, as it's quite a big talking point when comparing a CPU of old to something that's newer, especially as IPC improvements can really alter some of those key factors. It's here when we look at the power consumption that the Ryzen 5 1600 is the more efficient of the 2 CPUs, but that is very much expected. While the Ryzen 1st gen CPUs weren't bad for power consumption based on their performance, it could be argued, I guess with the generational uplifts we saw from AMD, the Ryzen 7000 series clearly offers more performance, but at a cost in terms of power. Though even then, across 13 games, there are some examples like Hogwarts Legacy with ray tracing on, where the Ryzen 5 7600 only uses 9% more power overall, and the largest margin coming by the way of Starfield, where we see a much larger 25% increase in power consumption. Putting it all into perspective, there really isn't much in it when looking at an extra kilowatt hour of usage equating to 55 hours of solid game time for a little extra cost. Beyond that though, you'd expect that the more powerful processor, and more refined for that matter, to be the more power hungry CPU. It's kind of a given. Now with power also comes heat, and it's evident that our chart follows the same pattern, with the Ryzen 5 7600 outputting more heat compared to the Ryzen 5 1600. And with the game that showed us the most power consumption being Starfield, also being the game that showed us the highest temperatures. Now in all, it's quite nice to see temperatures that are, I guess, 50 degrees and under, though I don't think anyone realistically will be using a CPU from 6 years ago with one of the latest and greatest NZXT 360mm AIO coolers either. So it's a bit, I guess, overkill in that department. Again though, we do see some quite large differences, with between a 20 to 30 degree variance between each CPU when running games. So how to sum this one up? Well, it's an odd one, because coming into this there was no real purpose as such, because who compares a Ryzen 5 1600 to a Ryzen 5 7600? Well, I do, and for a very good reason, which I will get to. Firstly, let's just round things off by saying that the Ryzen 5 1600 has aged, well, very poorly. That's clear to see, where it presented us with severe bottlenecks at practically every resolution in every game. It just shows that while the Ryzen 5 1600 was good back in the day and gave some pretty solid performance for the money, that's just not the case anymore, as games have become more reliant on newer and higher end hardware, which I guess was the point of this video. Not so much to show how an old CPU does against a new CPU, but more to show what the older chip isn't able to do anymore. And I think we showed that pretty clearly. Now what is worth noting is the whole point behind this video, beyond just showing that it's not something I'd stick with in 2023, but more to start building up some data so that we can show what kind of an upgrade path you have available to you. As our next video like this will actually be showing the Ryzen 5 1600 against the Ryzen 5 2600, and so on. And yes, don't worry, we will be putting the 5800X3D in for good measure eventually, because in a lot of cases, especially when looking at changing platforms versus a simple CPU change, sticking with AM4 may still be the logical choice, and the Zen 4 based 7600 just might not be worth it in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, that's for another video. For now, that about wraps this one up. If you enjoyed it, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing, and if you love what we do, then as I mentioned earlier, maybe consider joining the super exclusive Patreon members club, where you'll have all of the charts for all of the games that we tested today, along with tons of other cool perks, including behind the scenes content, exclusive bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye bye.